June 6th, 1944. 0130 hours, 3,000 feet above Normandy, France. The temperature was 8 degrees Celsius, and anti-aircraft fire lit the sky when Sergeant Thomas Caldwell felt the C-47 aircraft lurch violently to the left. Caldwell was 28 years old, leading a stick of 12 Canadian paratroopers from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, and they were supposed to drop near a bridge 8 kilometers inland from Juno Beach. The plan was to secure the bridge before German forces could blow it up, but the C-47 was taking heavy flak damage, and the pilot was screaming that they needed to drop immediately or the aircraft would go down with everyone aboard. Caldwell looked at his watch. 0132 hours. They were dropping 4 minutes early and had no idea where they were. He shouted to his men, "Stand up! Hook up!" The red light turned green. Caldwell jumped into darkness. Thomas Caldwell came from Winnipeg, Manitoba. His father operated a hardware store, and Caldwell had grown up learning to fix things: machinery, tools, problems. He joined the Canadian Army in 1940 at age 24 and volunteered for paratrooper training in 1942 when the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was formed. Paratrooper training was brutal, jumping from towers, aircraft exits, landing techniques, weapons proficiency. Caldwell was natural at it. He understood how to control his body in freefall and could land without injury consistently. By 1944, he had been promoted to sergeant and put in charge of a 12-man stick. His stick consisted of men from across Canada. Corporal James Mitchell from Toronto, 23 years old, quiet, competent rifleman. Private Robert Walsh from Montreal, 26, spoke French and English, good with explosives. Private David Henderson from Vancouver, 21, youngest in the stick, eager but inexperienced. Private William Fraser from Calgary, 29, oldest, steady under pressure, and 7 others. They had trained together for 8 months preparing for D-Day. They knew their mission: drop near the bridge, secure it, hold it until relieved by advancing infantry from Juno Beach. The jump went wrong immediately. The C-47's evasive maneuvers to avoid flak meant the drop was scattered. Caldwell landed hard in a field, rolled, and came up with his rifle ready. He was alone. He could hear aircraft overhead and anti-aircraft fire, but saw no other paratroopers. Standard procedure was to use a cricket clicker to identify friendlies, 1 click answered by 2 clicks. Caldwell clicked once. Nothing. He clicked again. Still nothing. Over the next 20 minutes, Caldwell found 5 of his men: Mitchell, Walsh, Henderson, Fraser, and 3 others: Private Thomas Brennan, Halifax, Private John Morrison, Ottawa, and Private Charles Sullivan, Regina. 7 men total. 5 were missing and probably scattered across kilometers of Norman countryside. Caldwell had to make a decision: spend hours searching for the others and risk missing the mission window, or proceed with 7 men instead of 12. He decided to proceed. He told his men, "We're 7 instead of 12. Our mission stays the same: secure the bridge. Let's move." They moved through dark fields toward where Caldwell estimated the bridge should be based on last known aircraft position. They navigated by compass and by studying terrain features in the moonlight. After 30 minutes of cautious movement, Caldwell realized something was wrong. The terrain didn't match the maps they had memorized. The bridge should have been 2 kilometers from their landing point. They had walked 3 kilometers and seen no bridge. Walsh said quietly, "Sergeant, I don't think we're where we're supposed to be." Caldwell agreed. "We're off target. Question is, how far?" Mitchell suggested, "We could search for landmarks, try to triangulate position." Henderson said, "Or we could find Germans and ask them." The others looked at him. Henderson clarified, "I mean capture Germans and take their maps." Caldwell considered this. Finding Germans would be easy. Normandy was full of them. Capturing Germans without alerting the entire area would be harder, but Henderson's suggestion had merit. German units would have maps showing their positions. Those maps would help Caldwell figure out where his stick had landed. They continued moving carefully through fields and hedgerows. At 0230 hours, they encountered their first Germans, 2 sentries standing guard outside a small building. Caldwell signaled his men to take positions surrounding the sentries. Then he and Mitchell approached silently from behind. They were 5 meters away when one sentry turned and saw them. The sentry opened his mouth to shout. Mitchell shot him with a silenced Sten gun. The second sentry spun around, and Caldwell shot him with his Thompson submachine gun, not silenced, very loud. The suppressed Sten worked. The Thompson didn't. Caldwell's gunfire echoed across the field. Germans inside the building shouted and began scrambling. Caldwell shouted to his men, "Assault the building! Go!" 7 paratroopers rushed the building. It was a small stone farmhouse with 2 rooms. Germans were grabbing weapons and trying to organize defense, but the paratroopers were faster and more aggressive. Caldwell kicked open the door and threw a grenade inside. The explosion killed 3 Germans. The remaining Germans, approximately 8 men, tried to surrender, but were shot in the chaos of the assault. Within 60 seconds, all German resistance in the building ceased. Caldwell's stick secured the building and checked for survivors. They found none. All 10 Germans were dead. Caldwell felt the familiar mix of relief and revulsion that came after close combat. Relief that his men survived. Revulsion at the violence required. Then Walsh called from the other room. "Sergeant, you need to see this." Caldwell entered the second room and stopped. The room was full of radio equipment, maps, and German officers' uniforms. This wasn't a random sentry post. This was a command post. Walsh was examining maps spread across a table. The maps showed German defensive positions across a 20-kilometer sector of Normandy coast. Troop positions, artillery positions, minefields, communication lines. Caldwell looked at the maps and understood immediately what they had stumbled into. This was a German headquarters, probably battalion or regimental level, coordinating defensive operations. The maps showed exactly where German forces were positioned to defend against Allied invasion. Mitchell said, "Sergeant, these maps, these show everything. If we get these back to our lines, command could use this." Caldwell agreed, but they had a problem. They had just killed 10 Germans at a headquarters building. German forces would notice the headquarters going silent. Reinforcements would come to investigate. Caldwell and his 7 men would be outnumbered and surrounded. He made a quick decision. Take all maps, all documents, anything that looks important. Destroy the radio equipment. We need to move before Germans realize what happened. His men grabbed maps, documents, code books, and other intelligence materials. Walsh smashed the radio equipment with his rifle butt. Fraser found a stack of documents describing German defensive plans for this sector. Invaluable intelligence. They were preparing to leave when Henderson said, "Sergeant, I hear vehicles." Caldwell listened. Truck engines. Multiple vehicles approaching from the east. The Germans had noticed something was wrong and were sending reinforcements. Caldwell looked at his men. 7 paratroopers with rifles and submachine guns. Unknown number of Germans arriving in trucks, probably 30 to 50 soldiers. Defending the headquarters building against that many was suicide, but running across open fields while carrying intelligence documents would make them easy targets. Then Caldwell looked at the headquarters building and had a wild idea. What if we don't run? What if we defend this position? Mitchell said, "Sergeant, we're outnumbered maybe 7 to 1. True. But we're in a defensive position. We have cover. They'll have to attack across open ground, and if we hold this headquarters, we deny Germans their command and communication for this sector. That's worth something on D-Day." Walsh said, "How long do we hold? Until relieved, or until we can't hold anymore?" Henderson asked, "What about our actual mission, the bridge?" Caldwell realized Henderson was right. They were supposed to be securing a bridge 8 kilometers away. Instead, they were accidentally defending a German headquarters they had stumbled into. This was completely wrong. But circumstances had changed. Holding this headquarters might be more valuable than securing that bridge. He made his decision. Our mission was to support D-Day by denying Germans mobility. Holding this headquarters denies them command and communication. It's not the mission we planned, but it's the mission we have. We hold until we can't. His men accepted this. They prepared defensive positions inside the headquarters building. The stone walls provided good cover. Windows became firing positions. Walsh rigged grenades as booby traps near the doors. Fraser positioned himself with a Bren light machine gun covering the main approach. Caldwell distributed their limited ammunition and told his men to make every shot count. At 02:45 hours, German trucks arrived. Caldwell watched through a window as 3 trucks stopped 200 meters away and German soldiers dismounted. He counted approximately 40 Germans. They were organizing for assault. A German officer, probably a captain, shouted toward the headquarters building in German. Caldwell understood enough German to get the message: surrender immediately or be killed. Caldwell shouted back in English, Canadian paratroopers holding this position. Come and take it if you can. The German officer looked confused. He probably hadn't expected Canadians. Then he ordered his men to attack. 40 Germans began advancing across the field toward the headquarters. Fraser opened fire with the Bren gun, cutting down the first 3 Germans. The others hit the ground and began returning fire. Bullets smashed into the stone walls of the headquarters. Windows shattered. Caldwell's men fired back with rifles and stens, trying to make each shot count. The firefight lasted 20 minutes. Germans tried to advance multiple times, but concentrated fire from the headquarters drove them back each time. Fraser's Bren gun was devastating. He fired in controlled bursts, making the Germans believe they faced more defenders than 7 men. After 20 minutes, the German officer called retreat. The Germans pulled back to their trucks, dragging wounded with them. Caldwell counted casualties. Germans had lost approximately 12 killed and probably 20 wounded. His stick had lost 0. Henderson had taken a bullet graze across his arm, but was still combat effective. Walsh's position had taken heavy fire, but the stone walls held. Mitchell said, they'll attack again, and next time they'll bring more men and maybe artillery. Caldwell knew Mitchell was right. The Germans now knew the headquarters was held by a small force. They would mass more troops and try again. Caldwell's stick needed to either get reinforcements or evacuate before the next assault. But evacuating meant abandoning the headquarters and the intelligence they had captured. Caldwell looked at the maps and documents spread across the table. This intelligence could save Allied lives during the D-Day landings. Getting it back to Allied command was critical. He told his men, we hold as long as possible. When we can't hold anymore, we destroy anything we can't carry and fight our way out. Understood? Understood, Sergeant. At 03:15 hours, Caldwell heard engines again. More German vehicles, but this time the sound was different. Heavier vehicles, possibly armored. He looked through a window and saw German half-tracks arriving. 4 half-tracks carrying approximately 60 more German soldiers plus machine guns. Caldwell realized his situation had gone from difficult to nearly impossible. 7 paratroopers couldn't hold against 60-plus Germans with vehicle-mounted machine guns. But they could make the Germans pay heavily before falling. The German half-tracks positioned themselves 300 meters from the headquarters and began firing machine guns at the building. Caldwell's men took cover as bullets tore through windows and chipped stone from the walls. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Vehicle-mounted MG-42 machine guns firing 1,200 rounds per minute. The headquarters building was being hammered. Fraser tried to return fire with the Bren gun, but incoming fire forced him down. Walsh threw a grenade through a window toward the half-tracks, but it exploded short, causing no damage. Henderson fired his rifle at German infantry advancing behind the half-tracks, but couldn't slow them. Caldwell assessed the situation. The headquarters had one advantage: stone walls that could withstand machine gun fire, but the Germans had overwhelming firepower. They would eventually breach the building through concentrated fire or bring up heavier weapons. Caldwell's stick needed to survive long enough for something to change. Allied reinforcements arriving, Germans running out of ammunition, or daylight revealing their position to Allied aircraft. The Germans assaulted again at 03:30 hours. 60 soldiers advanced behind suppressive fire from the half-tracks. They reached within 50 meters of the headquarters before Caldwell's men opened concentrated fire. Fraser used the last of his Bren ammunition in one devastating burst that killed 5 Germans. Mitchell and Caldwell fired their Thompsons, cutting down more attackers. Walsh threw their last grenades. The German assault stalled at 30 meters. Too many casualties. The Germans retreated again, dragging wounded. Caldwell counted German losses, approximately 18 killed, 30 wounded. But his ammunition situation was critical. They had maybe 200 rounds total remaining. Fraser's Bren gun was out of ammunition entirely. They had no grenades left. Morrison had been hit during the assault, a bullet through his shoulder. He was conscious, but losing blood. Brennan bandaged Morrison's wound with a field dressing, but Morrison needed proper medical care. At 0400 hours, the Germans changed tactics. Instead of assaulting, they began setting up mortars 400 meters away. Caldwell watched through binoculars as Germans positioned 2 mortar tubes and began ranging shots. The first mortar round exploded 50 meters short. The second round hit 20 meters from the building. The Germans were zeroing in. Caldwell understood mortar fire would destroy the headquarters. Stone walls that stopped bullets wouldn't stop high-explosive mortar rounds. Once the Germans got the range correct, they would pound the building until it collapsed, or everyone inside was dead. He told his men, "We can't survive mortar fire. We need to evacuate now while we still can." Mitchell asked, "What about the intelligence?" Caldwell looked at the maps and documents. They had gathered maybe 20 pounds of paper, too much to carry while fighting through German lines. They needed to prioritize. He told Fraser and Walsh, "Pick the most important documents. Maps showing troop positions, defensive plans, anything showing German strategy. Leave everything else." Fraser and Walsh quickly sorted documents, selecting the most valuable intelligence. They stuffed maps into packs and pockets. Caldwell grabbed a folder marked Verteidigungsplan, defense plan, that showed the entire German defensive strategy for this coastal sector. The third mortar round hit the building's roof, blowing a hole through tiles. The fourth round exploded inside the building, in the room where they had first found the intelligence. The explosion was deafening. Stone debris and dust filled the air. Caldwell shouted, "We move now! Out the back window! Go!" His men climbed through the rear window one by one, while mortar rounds continued hitting the building. Sullivan helped Morrison through, despite Morrison's shoulder wound. They ran across an open field toward a tree line 200 meters away. German soldiers saw them and opened fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around the fleeing paratroopers. Henderson was hit in the leg and went down. Fraser doubled back, grabbed Henderson and dragged him toward the trees, while Mitchell provided covering fire. They reached the tree line as the 5th mortar round completely destroyed the headquarters building's western wall. 7 paratroopers, 1 wounded seriously, Morrison, 1 wounded moderately, Henderson, regrouped in the trees. They had escaped the headquarters, but were now in unfamiliar terrain, with Germans actively hunting them. They had valuable intelligence, but no idea where Allied lines were. Caldwell checked his compass and maps. Based on the sun rising in the east and terrain features, he estimated they were approximately 12 kilometers from Juno Beach, much further inland than their original drop zone. To reach Allied lines, they needed to move west through German-held territory while carrying 2 wounded men and intelligence documents. They moved through hedgerows and fields, avoiding roads and open areas. German patrols were everywhere. The invasion had clearly begun, and Germans were responding. Caldwell's stick heard artillery in the distance and saw aircraft overhead. Allied aircraft, which meant the invasion was underway. At 0600 hours, they encountered Canadian infantry advancing inland from Juno Beach. The infantry were from the Regina Rifle Regiment, part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Caldwell identified himself and his stick. The infantry commander, a captain, was shocked. "Sergeant, you're 12 kilometers inland. How did you get here?" Caldwell explained. "We dropped in the wrong location. We captured a German headquarters by accident. We have intelligence." The captain looked skeptical until Caldwell showed him the maps and documents. The captain's expression changed immediately. "This shows German positions across the entire sector. Command needs this immediately." The captain radioed back to beach headquarters. Within 30 minutes, an intelligence officer arrived by jeep, a major from Division Intelligence. The major examined the documents Caldwell's stick had captured and went pale. "Sergeant, do you understand what you have here? This is the German defensive plan for 20 kilometers of coastline. Troop positions, artillery positions, reserve locations, communication networks. This is extraordinary intelligence." Caldwell said, "We captured it from a headquarters building we assaulted by mistake. We were supposed to drop near a bridge 8 kilometers from here." The major said, "What bridge?" Caldwell described their assigned objective. The major checked his maps and said, "That bridge was blown up by Germans 6 hours ago. Your assigned mission was already failed before you jumped, but capturing this headquarters. You've provided intelligence that will save hundreds of lives during the advance inland." Caldwell and his stick were evacuated to beach headquarters. Morrison and Henderson were sent to field hospitals. The remaining 5 men, Caldwell, Mitchell, Walsh, Fraser, and Brennan, were debriefed by intelligence officers who asked detailed questions about the headquarters. How many Germans were there? What equipment? What documents were visible? What was destroyed? Over the following days, the intelligence captured by Caldwell's stick was used to plan Allied advances. The documents showed where German strongpoints were located, which allowed Allied forces to avoid heavily defended areas and exploit weak points. The defensive plans revealed German strategy, which allowed Allied commanders to anticipate German responses. In late June 1944, Caldwell received a message that his commanding officer wanted to see him. Caldwell reported to battalion headquarters, expecting either commendation or reprimand for abandoning his assigned mission. Lieutenant Colonel Fraser Eady, commanding officer of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, looked at Caldwell and said, "Sergeant, I've reviewed your actions on D-Day. You were assigned to secure a bridge. You failed that mission completely." Caldwell said, "Yes, sir. We dropped in the wrong location and couldn't reach the bridge." Eady continued, "Instead, you assaulted a German headquarters, captured intelligence of extraordinary value, held that headquarters against superior numbers for 90 minutes, evacuated with the intelligence, and returned to Allied lines, all while losing 0 men killed and only 2 wounded." "Yes, sir." "Sergeant Caldwell, you failed your assigned mission and succeeded at a mission you weren't assigned. I'm recommending you and your entire stick for decorations. You captured intelligence that has saved Allied lives and will continue saving lives as we advance." Caldwell didn't know what to say. Eady smiled. "Sometimes the wrong objective turns out to be the right objective. Well done, Sergeant." Aftermath. Caldwell and his stick received military medals for their D-Day actions. The citation mentioned extraordinary initiative and courage in capturing valuable enemy intelligence while operating behind enemy lines. The citation didn't mention they were supposed to be somewhere else entirely. The 5 missing paratroopers from Caldwell's stick eventually rejoined the battalion. They had landed scattered across 15 kilometers, regrouped in small groups, and fought their way back to Allied lines over several days. All 5 survived. Morrison recovered from his shoulder wound and returned to duty in August 1944. Henderson's leg wound required surgery, but he recovered fully and also returned to duty. Both men continued serving through the remainder of the war. The captured German intelligence was used extensively during Allied operations in Normandy. The defensive plans showed German strategy for counterattacking Allied beachheads, which allowed Allied commanders to position forces effectively to counter those attacks. The maps showing artillery positions were used to target German guns with Allied counter-battery fire. An intelligence officer later estimated that the intelligence captured by Caldwell's stick contributed to saving approximately 200 Allied lives during the first week of the Normandy campaign by allowing forces to avoid heavily defended positions and exploit weaknesses in German defenses. Post-war. Caldwell returned to Canada in 1945 and resumed civilian life in Winnipeg. He worked in his father's hardware store and later owned his own store. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would say he served with paratroopers in Normandy and leave it at that. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, a military historian contacted Caldwell asking about his D-Day experience. Caldwell was 68 years old. The historian had found battalion records describing the headquarters assault and intelligence capture. The historian asked Caldwell to explain what happened. Caldwell described the mission: dropping in the wrong location, assaulting the headquarters by accident, capturing intelligence, holding against German assaults, evacuating with the intelligence. The historian was fascinated. "You were assigned to capture a bridge, but instead captured a German headquarters?" "That's correct," Caldwell said. "And the bridge you were supposed to capture was already destroyed before you jumped?" "Yes, so we couldn't have succeeded at our assigned mission anyway." The historian asked, "Do you think dropping in the wrong location was fortunate?" Caldwell thought carefully. "I don't think it was fortunate. It was chaotic. We were scattered, lost, outnumbered. We stumbled into that headquarters accidentally. We made decisions based on circumstances we couldn't control. It worked out, but it could easily have ended differently. If those 10 Germans at the headquarters had been more alert, they would have killed us. If German reinforcements had arrived 5 minutes earlier, we would have been trapped. We succeeded through a combination of aggression, luck, and German mistakes." The historian asked, "But you held that headquarters against superior numbers for 90 minutes. That wasn't luck." "No," Caldwell agreed. "That was stubbornness. We had intelligence that needed to get back to Allied command. We held until we couldn't hold any more. Then we evacuated and completed the mission. That part was deliberate." In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Caldwell attended ceremonies in Normandy with other D-Day veterans. He met with French civilians who lived in the area where his stick had operated. One elderly Frenchman approached Caldwell and said through a translator, "I was 14 years old on D-Day. I watched from my family's farm as 7 Canadian paratroopers fought maybe 100 Germans at a headquarters building. You held that building for over an hour. We thought you were insane. Then you escaped and the Germans destroyed the building with mortars. We thought you were all dead. I'm glad to see you survived." Caldwell thanked the man. The man continued, "That headquarters coordinated German defenses in this sector. After you destroyed it and killed the officers, German forces in this area became disorganized." Allied forces advanced more quickly because German command was disrupted. You may not have known it at the time, but what you did mattered. Caldwell died in 2002 at age 86. His obituary mentioned his D-Day service and military medal, but didn't describe the specific circumstances. Most people reading the obituary would never know that Caldwell and his stick had failed their assigned mission completely, while succeeding at an unassigned mission that saved Allied lives. The lesson. The lesson from Caldwell's story is about adapting to circumstances beyond your control. Caldwell and his stick were supposed to secure a bridge. They dropped in the wrong location, couldn't find the bridge, and accidentally assaulted a German headquarters instead. Everything went wrong with their plan, but they adapted. When they realized they were lost, they didn't panic or freeze. They gathered information by capturing Germans. When they discovered the headquarters was full of intelligence, they recognized its value. When Germans counterattacked, they defended aggressively. When the situation became untenable, they evacuated with the intelligence. None of this was planned. It was improvisation based on circumstances. The original plan failed completely, but Caldwell made decisions based on what was possible rather than what was planned. He assessed each situation as it developed and chose actions that made sense given available information and resources. This is different from most military success stories where plans work as intended. Caldwell's plan failed. His success came from recognizing the plan had failed and adapting, rather than rigidly following a plan that no longer applied. The intelligence captured accidentally was more valuable than the bridge they were supposed to secure. The bridge was already destroyed, so their assigned mission was impossible before they even jumped. But the headquarters they captured by accident provided intelligence that saved Allied lives. Through accident and adaptation, they accomplished something more important than their assigned mission. Sometimes failing the plan is necessary to succeed at the mission. The plan was to secure a bridge. The mission was to support D-Day invasion. Caldwell failed the plan, but succeeded at the mission through improvisation and adaptation. That's worth recognizing. Plans fail constantly, but missions can still succeed if people adapt to circumstances. Caldwell and his stick made this work through aggression, quick decisions, and willingness to take risks. They assaulted a headquarters they stumbled into. They held it against superior numbers. They evacuated under fire with valuable intelligence. None of this was in the plan. All of it contributed to mission success. Sometimes the wrong objective is the right objective. Sometimes getting lost leads to finding something more valuable than what you were looking for. Sometimes failing the plan is the first step to succeeding at the mission. Caldwell understood this instinctively and acted on it. That's why 7 paratroopers who dropped in the wrong place accomplished more than they would have if they had dropped in the right place. July 18th, 1944, Normandy, France, 15 kilometers south of Caen. The temperature was 22 degrees Celsius, and smoke from artillery fire drifted across farmland when Lieutenant David Morrison realized he was trapped behind German lines with no way back to Canadian forces. Morrison was 27 years old, a scout with the Regina Rifle Regiment, and he had been sent forward to gather intelligence on German panzer positions before a planned Canadian attack. The mission was simple: observe German tank concentrations, note locations, return with intelligence. But German forces had counterattacked while Morrison was scouting, pushing Canadian lines back 3 kilometers. Morrison was now isolated in enemy territory with valuable intelligence and no clear route home. He crouched in a hedgerow, watching German soldiers move along a road 100 meters away, and calculated his options. Try to infiltrate back through German lines on foot, extremely risky. Hide and wait for Canadian forces to advance again, could take days or weeks. Or surrender, unacceptable. He had intelligence that needed to reach Canadian command. Then Morrison saw something that gave him a fourth option: a dead German soldier lying in a ditch 50 meters away, approximately Morrison's build. Morrison spoke fluent German. His grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria, and he had grown up speaking German at home. He made a decision that would either save his life or get him executed as a spy. He would take the dead German's uniform and papers and pretend to be a German soldier until he could escape back to Allied lines. David Morrison came from Regina, Saskatchewan. His grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria in the early 1900s and settled in a German-Canadian community. Morrison grew up speaking German at home and English at school. By age 10, he was fluently bilingual. When war began in 1939, Morrison enlisted in the Canadian Army. When officers discovered he spoke fluent German, they trained him as a scout and interrogator. Morrison's German was so fluent, no accent, perfect grammar, Bavarian idioms from his grandparents, that German prisoners often assumed he was German himself. Morrison deployed to Britain in 1943 and landed in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. By mid-July, Canadian forces were fighting toward Caen against German panzer divisions. Canadian command needed intelligence about exact panzer positions. Morrison was assigned scout missions: go forward, observe German positions, return with intelligence. On July 18th, Morrison was sent to locate German panzer concentrations south of Caen. He moved through hedgerows before dawn, reaching a position 3 kilometers ahead of Canadian lines by 0600 hours. He observed German positions through binoculars for 2 hours. Panther tanks in tree lines, artillery emplacements camouflaged with netting, supply trucks moving ammunition. Morrison noted everything: tank types, quantities, exact locations. By 0800 hours, he had valuable intelligence and prepared to return. But at 0815 hours, German forces launched a counterattack. Morrison heard artillery firing and saw German infantry advancing toward Canadian positions. The counterattack pushed Canadian forces back. Morrison heard radio traffic, Canadian units retreating 3 kilometers north. Morrison was now behind German lines. He had 2 problems: isolated in enemy territory and carrying intelligence Canadian command desperately needed. Infiltrating back through German lines on foot was extremely dangerous. German forces advancing, heightened alert, patrols everywhere. Hiding and waiting could take weeks, and his intelligence would be obsolete. Surrendering was unacceptable. Morrison considered options while watching German soldiers pass. Then he saw the dead German soldier in a ditch 50 meters away. The body was fresh, killed recently during the counterattack, probably by Canadian artillery. A shell had exploded nearby, killing this soldier and 2 others whose bodies lay further along the ditch. The soldier appeared approximately Morrison's height and build. Morrison had an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal. Take the dead German's uniform and identity, pretend to be a German soldier, and walk through German territory until he found opportunity to slip back to Allied lines. Extremely risky. Germans would execute him as spy if discovered, but less risky than trying to sneak through German lines as a Canadian scout. Morrison moved to the ditch and examined the dead German. The soldier was a Gefreiter, Lance Corporal, named Klaus Weber, age 24 according to his Soldbuch, paybook. Weber had been killed by shrapnel, wounds to chest. His uniform was blood-stained but intact. Morrison stripped Weber's body, taking the uniform, helmet, equipment belt, Soldbuch, and identification tags. He hid his Canadian uniform under leaves. Then Morrison put on Weber's uniform. It fit reasonably well, slightly tight in shoulders but acceptable. Morrison checked Weber's Soldbuch carefully. Weber was assigned to 12th SS Panzer Division, 2nd Company, stationed near Caen. Morrison would need to know this if questioned. Morrison also took Weber's rifle, a Carabiner 98K. Carrying the rifle was essential to looking like a German soldier. Morrison studied his appearance. He looked like a German soldier. Uniform authentic, helmet fit, rifle natural. His German was fluent and accent-free. The only risk was encountering someone who knew Weber personally, but 12th SS Panzer Division had thousands of soldiers. Encountering someone who knew Weber was unlikely if Morrison stayed away from Weber's specific unit. Morrison made his decision. He would pose as Gefreiter Klaus Weber until he could escape back to Allied lines. He estimated this would take hours, perhaps a day. He didn't anticipate 3 days. Morrison left the ditch and walked onto the road where German soldiers were regrouping. He joined approximately 30 soldiers from various units. Morrison kept quiet, listening to conversations. A sergeant approached Morrison. "You're from 12th SS Panzer Division?" Morrison said in German, "Yes, Herr Unteroffizier, 2nd Company." "What are you doing here? Your unit is 5 kilometers east." Morrison improvised. "Separated during the counterattack, trying to rejoin my company." The sergeant accepted this. Soldiers getting separated was common. "Head east along this road. You'll find 12th SS positions near the village." Morrison thanked the sergeant and began walking east with other Germans. He was now actively participating in German military movement, wearing enemy uniform, carrying enemy weapons, speaking German with Germans who believed he was one of them. Every step deeper increased risk of discovery and execution, but turning back was impossible. He was surrounded. After 2 kilometers, Morrison reached a German assembly area where units were regrouping. Approximately 200 German soldiers near a farmhouse serving as command post. Morrison joined them, trying to remain inconspicuous. A German officer, an Oberleutnant, was organizing soldiers. "All soldiers from 12th SS Panzer Division report here." Morrison hesitated. Reporting meant grouping with 12th SS, who might know Weber. Not reporting might attract attention. Morrison walked toward the officer, but stayed at back of the group. Approximately 15 soldiers gathered. The Oberleutnant said, "You men will escort supply trucks to ammunition depot 3 kilometers north. Move out immediately." The group walked to supply trucks. Morrison and 14 Germans rode in one truck, while the convoy drove north through German-held territory. Morrison sat quietly, listening. 2 soldiers near Morrison discussed the counterattack. One said, "We pushed Canadians back 3 kilometers this morning, but they'll counterattack soon." The other said, "Let them. We have Panthers and Tigers. Canadian Shermans are no match." Morrison listened carefully. Intelligence. German soldiers confident in armor superiority. He needed to remember this. After 30 minutes, the convoy arrived at an ammunition depot, a camouflaged supply point where artillery ammunition was stored in dugouts. Soldiers began unloading. Morrison helped, moving wooden crates of artillery shells from trucks to dugouts. He was now actively supporting German military operations while wearing German uniform. This created severe moral discomfort. Morrison was Canadian. His duty was fighting Germans, not helping them resupply. But refusing would expose him. He unloaded ammunition while mentally cataloging everything: depot location, ammunition quantities, storage methods, guard numbers, all intelligence Canadian forces could use. After unloading, the Oberleutnant said, "You men remain here tonight. Depot needs guards. Tomorrow, you'll return to units." Morrison's heart sank. He had hoped to slip away during convoy, but now assigned guard duty at German depot with 14 Germans. He would spend night surrounded by enemies with no escape opportunity. Soldiers were assigned guard shifts. Morrison was assigned 0200 to 0400 hours, middle of night. Until then, free time. Soldiers gathered near a dugout serving as sleeping quarters. They ate rations, talked, smoked. Morrison participated minimally, speaking only when spoken to. One soldier asked Morrison, "Where are you from?" Morrison said, "Bavaria, near Munich." "I'm from Bavaria too. Which town?" Morrison's grandparents had been from near Munich. Morrison said, "Small village. You wouldn't know it. Try me. I know Bavaria well." Morrison improvised, "Pentsburg." The soldier nodded. "I know Pentsburg. Coal mining town. Hard place." Morrison agreed, and the soldier moved to another topic. Morrison breathed carefully. He needed to be more careful. As evening came, Morrison lay in the dugout with Germans, listening to them talk about families, home, war. Several expressed war weariness, tired of fighting, wanting home, doubting Germany could win. Valuable intelligence about morale. Morrison memorized conversations. At midnight, Morrison tried to sleep but couldn't. He was in a German dugout, surrounded by Germans who would execute him if they discovered he was Canadian. Stress was enormous. Every sound made him alert. Every time someone approached, he worried. Have they discovered who I am? At 0200 hours, Morrison was woken for guard duty. He took position at depot perimeter with another guard, a soldier named Friedrich from Hamburg, who talked constantly. Friedrich complained about war, officers, food quality. Morrison listened and made minimal responses. During the 2-hour shift, Morrison watched for escape opportunities. Depot was in farmland with hedgerows extending in all directions. Canadian lines approximately 5 kilometers north. If Morrison could slip away during darkness, he might reach Canadian positions by dawn. But escape, impossible. Friedrich with him constantly. Guards positioned every 50 meters around perimeter. Running would be noticed immediately. Morrison would be shot before covering 100 meters. At 0400 hours, Morrison's shift ended. He returned to dugout and tried to sleep. Managed perhaps 1 hour before soldiers awakened at 0600. The Oberleutnant arrived. Ammunition trucks returning to supply depot. You men will escort them. After that, return to units. Morrison felt relief. Trucks returning, hopefully closer to front lines, where he might slip away. The convoy drove south 40 minutes, arriving at larger supply depot near a town. Approximately 500 German soldiers, supply personnel, infantry resting, repair crews. Morrison helped unload, then the Oberleutnant dismissed them. Return to your units. Other soldiers left in various directions. Morrison walked away confidently, as if he knew where he was going, planning to find hiding place and wait for darkness.
But a sergeant called, "You, Gefreiter Weber."
Morrison's blood went cold. Someone had called Weber's name. Morrison turned. A sergeant approaching, man in 30s with scarred face.
"Weber, where's your unit?"
Morrison said, "2nd Company, 12th SS Panzer Division, Herr Feldwebel." "I know that. Where are they positioned?" Morrison said honestly, "I don't know, Herr Feldwebel. Separated during counterattack yesterday, trying to rejoin." The sergeant studied Morrison suspiciously. "You've been separated a full day and haven't found your unit." "Situation has been chaotic, Herr Feldwebel." Suspicion deepened. Morrison prepared to run. Then the sergeant said, "Come with me. I'll take you to 12th SS positions." Morrison had no choice. He followed the sergeant to a motorcycle with sidecar. Sergeant started engine. Morrison climbed in. They drove east, passing German positions, artillery, Panther tanks camouflaged in tree lines. Morrison memorized everything, more intelligence. After 20 minutes, they reached farmhouse serving as 12th SS Panzer Division headquarters. Sergeant stopped. "Wait here. I'll find where 2nd Company is." Sergeant went inside. Morrison sat calculating. He could run now, but Germans everywhere. Running would attract attention. He would be shot. Sergeant emerged with Lieutenant. Lieutenant approached Morrison. "You're Gefreiter Weber?" "Yes, Herr Oberleutnant." "I'm from 3rd Company. I don't know you, but 2nd Company is positioned 2 kilometers north. Sergeant will take you." Morrison realized with horror, being taken to Weber's actual unit, where soldiers would know Weber personally. Morrison would be exposed immediately. He needed to escape before reaching 2nd Company. Sergeant returned to motorcycle. Morrison climbed in sidecar. They drove north. Morrison's mind raced. In 10 minutes, they'd reach 2nd Company. Someone there would recognize immediately Morrison wasn't Weber. He would be identified as imposter, interrogated, executed. Morrison needed to act now. As a motorcycle rounded curve, Morrison said loudly, "Herr Feldwebel, stop! I need to piss." Sergeant slowed and stopped. Morrison climbed out and walked toward bushes at roadside. Sergeant remained with motorcycle, smoking. Morrison walked behind bushes. He had perhaps 30 seconds before Sergeant became suspicious. Morrison looked around. Bushes provided cover 20 meters before opening onto field. Beyond field was tree line, maybe 300 meters away. If Morrison ran for tree line, Sergeant would see, shout, possibly shoot. But Morrison had no option. In 10 minutes, he'd be at second company, where he'd certainly be exposed and executed. Running gave him chance. Small, but real. Morrison ran. He burst from bushes and sprinted across field toward tree line. Behind him, Sergeant shouted in German, "Halt! Stop!" Morrison kept running. Heard Sergeant shouting again, then gunshot. Bullet snapped past Morrison's head. Morrison zigzagged, making himself hard a target. Sergeant fired again. Bullet hit Morrison's left shoulder, grazing wound that tore fabric and skin. Morrison stumbled, but kept running. Pain burned through his shoulder. Blood soaked his uniform sleeve. Sergeant fired third shot. Bullet hit dirt beside Morrison. Morrison reached tree line and plunged into forest. More gunfire behind, but bullets hit trees. Morrison ran through forest, crashing through underbrush, no longer trying to be quiet, just trying to get distance. He ran 10 minutes before stopping to listen. No pursuit sounds. Either Sergeant had given up or was following quietly. Morrison moved carefully through forest, heading north by compass toward estimated Canadian positions. His shoulder burned. Blood dripped from fingers. He had perhaps 3 hours to navigate back to Canadian lines while bleeding from gunshot wound. For next 3 hours, Morrison navigated through Norman forest and farmland. He tore fabric from his undershirt and wrapped his shoulder to slow bleeding. The wound wasn't deep. Bullet had grazed skin and muscle, but hadn't hit bone. Painful, but not life-threatening, if he could stop bleeding. Morrison moved north, avoiding German positions when spotted, hiding when German patrols passed. He was exhausted, in pain, and still wearing German uniform, which made him target for both sides. Germans would shoot him as deserter, Canadians would shoot him as German. At approximately 1400 hours, Morrison reached frontline area. He could hear artillery, machine guns, combat sounds. He crouched in hedgerow and observed. Through gaps in smoke, he saw Canadian positions approximately 400 meters ahead. German positions behind him, approximately 300 meters. He was in no man's land. Morrison needed to reach Canadian lines without being shot by Canadians who would see only German uniform. He removed his German helmet and raised it on stick above hedgerow, waving it. Risky signal. Germans might see and shoot, but Canadians needed to see he was trying to signal. After 2 minutes waving, Morrison saw movement in Canadian positions. A Canadian soldier looking through binoculars. Morrison shouted in English as loudly as possible. "Canadian soldier, scout from Regina Rifles, don't shoot. I'm wearing German uniform, but I'm Canadian." No response. Morrison shouted again. "Lieutenant David Morrison, Regina Rifles. Intelligence officer sent me forward 3 days ago. I'm coming toward your position. Don't shoot." Silence. Morrison had to risk it. He stood from hedgerow, hands raised, German helmet on stick held high, and began walking slowly toward Canadian positions. He was fully visible. A German soldier with blood-soaked uniform, walking toward Canadian lines with hands raised. Machine gun fire erupted from Canadian positions. Bullets tore through air around Morrison. He dove to ground and shouted, "Don't shoot, I'm Canadian. Lieutenant Morrison, Regina Rifles." Machine gun fire stopped. Morrison heard shouting from Canadian positions. He stayed on ground, hands visible, and shouted again. "Lieutenant David Morrison, sent forward July 18th to scout panzer positions, wearing German uniform as disguise. Don't shoot. I'm wounded and bleeding." Voice from Canadian positions shouted in English, "Stay where you are. Don't move." Morrison stayed motionless. After several minutes, he saw 3 Canadian soldiers approaching cautiously with rifles aimed. They surrounded Morrison, weapons ready. One soldier said, "Who are you?" Morrison said, "Lieutenant David Morrison, Regina Rifle Regiment, Intelligence Section. Sent forward July 18th to scout German panzer positions. German counterattack cut me off. I took dead German's uniform and posed as German soldier 3 days to escape back to lines." Canadian soldier said skeptically, "Prove you're Canadian." Morrison provided details, commanding officer's name, unit designation, exact mission given 3 days ago, personal information only Regina Rifles officer would know. Soldiers remained suspicious. Morrison could be German spy who interrogated Canadian prisoners and learned details. Second soldier said, "You're wounded. Shoulders bleeding. German sergeant shot me when I escaped. Grazing wound. Could be wounded German soldier trying to surrender." Third soldier said, "We take him to HQ. Let officers decide. Could be spy." Morrison was escorted back to Canadian positions with rifles aimed at him entire time. Soldiers treated him as potential enemy until proven otherwise. At forward Canadian position, Morrison was questioned by a lieutenant who didn't recognize him. Morrison repeated his story. Lieutenant remained skeptical. "You expect me to believe you spent 3 days posing as German soldier?" "Yes, sir. I had intelligence about German panzer positions. Getting that intelligence back to command was critical. Posing as German was only viable way. Or you're German spy with good English." Morrison spent next hour being interrogated by increasingly senior officers, each skeptical. Finally, an intelligence officer who had briefed Morrison on July 18th arrived and recognized him. "That's Lieutenant Morrison. I briefed him 3 days ago on his scouting mission. He's genuine." Morrison was finally accepted as Canadian. Medical personnel treated his shoulder wound, cleaned, bandaged, not serious. Then, Morrison was brought to Regina Rifles headquarters for debriefing. Morrison provided full report. German panzer positions observed July 18th, ammunition depot locations, troop movements, morale observations from conversations with German soldiers, everything memorized over 3 days. Intelligence was extremely valuable. Morrison had observed German positions and activities for 3 days while living among Germans. Information no other scout could have obtained. Morrison's commanding officer, Major Robert Clark, said after debriefing, "Lieutenant, you took extraordinary risk. Impersonating enemy soldiers is extremely dangerous. If caught, Germans would have executed you as spy." Morrison said, "Yes, sir, but I had intelligence that needed to reach you. No other way to get back through German lines. Intelligence you provided is exceptionally valuable, but what you did, wearing enemy uniform, posing as enemy, is not standard procedure. Extremely risky." "I understand, sir." Major Clark paused. "Nevertheless, you showed remarkable resourcefulness and courage. Intelligence you gathered is being sent to division headquarters immediately. I'm recommending you for decoration." Morrison was awarded Military Cross in September 1944 for exceptional courage and resourcefulness in gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. Morrison continued serving as scout through remainder of Normandy campaign and into advance across France, Belgium, Germany. He never again impersonated German soldier. 3 days as Weber had been enough. But he continued scouting missions, gathering intelligence that helped Canadian forces plan operations. Morrison survived the war and returned to Canada in 1945. He resumed civilian life in Regina. He rarely spoke about war experiences. The 3 days posing as German remained private memory, something extraordinary done under desperate circumstances, but not particularly wanting public discussion. Post-war perspective. In 1967, military historian researching Canadian intelligence operations contacted Morrison about July 1944 mission. Morrison was 50 and hadn't discussed incident in detail for 20 years. Morrison described 3 days as Weber, taking uniform, joining Germans, escorting ammunition, overnight at depot, sergeant taking him toward unit, Desperate escape, terrifying return to Canadian lines. Historian asked, "How did you feel during those 3 days pretending to be German?" Morrison thought carefully. Terrified constantly. Every moment worried someone would recognize I wasn't Weber. Every conversation created risk. Every order forced difficult choices. When helping unload German ammunition, I was actively supporting enemy operations. That felt deeply wrong, but refusing would expose me immediately. Did you consider surrendering rather than impersonating German? Yes, but I had intelligence Canadian command needed urgently. Thousands of Canadian soldiers about to attack German positions. Intelligence I had could save their lives by showing where German strength was concentrated and where gaps existed. I couldn't surrender, knowing that information wouldn't reach command. Historian asked, "Looking back, do you think what you did was justified?" Morrison, quiet for a moment. Justified is a complicated word. What I did was necessary given circumstances. I was trapped with valuable intelligence. Impersonating German was only viable way to escape and deliver intelligence.
It worked. Intelligence helped Canadian operations. In that sense, yes, justified. But it created moral complications. I wore enemy uniform. I participated in enemy activities. I helped load ammunition that would be used against Canadians. These things troubled me then, and still trouble me now. War creates situations where clean moral choices don't exist. You do what seems necessary to accomplish mission, and hope outcome justifies methods. Morrison died in 1998, at age 81. The lesson. The lesson from Morrison's story is about extreme adaptation under desperate circumstances and moral complexity of deception in warfare. Morrison was trapped behind enemy lines with valuable intelligence. Conventional options, infiltrating through lines, hiding and waiting, were not viable. Morrison chose unconventional and extremely risky option: impersonate enemy soldier and live among enemy until escape opportunity emerged. This required multiple forms of deception: wearing enemy uniform, violation of military law if caught, actively participating in enemy activities, unloading ammunition, and maintaining false identity under constant scrutiny. Each created moral complications. Morrison helped the enemy while pretending to be one of them, but deception served purpose, delivering intelligence that would help Canadian forces and potentially save Canadian lives. Moral compromise was justified by outcome. Intelligence Morrison gathered over 3 days was exceptionally valuable and contributed to successful operations. What makes Morrison's story distinct is sustained nature of deception, not brief disguise or quick infiltration. Morrison lived as German soldier 3 days, eating with Germans, sleeping in German dugouts, participating in German operations. This required not just language skills, but psychological discipline. Morrison had to think like German soldier, respond naturally to German orders, maintain composure under extraordinary stress.
War creates situations where moral clarity is impossible. Morrison helped load ammunition used against Canadians, morally troubling. But refusing would expose him and prevent intelligence delivery that would save Canadian lives. No clean choice, only choices with different costs. Morrison understood complexity and carried it decades. 3 days as Weber troubled him not because wrong, but because morally complicated in ways simple combat was not. Combat had clear sides and purposes. Deception had ambiguity and compromise. Sometimes accomplishing missions requires methods creating moral discomfort. Sometimes saving lives requires helping enemy temporarily. Sometimes right choice is one that works rather than one that feels morally clean. Morrison understood and proceeded anyway. He survived. Intelligence reached command. Canadian operations benefited. Outcome, justified methods. That's sufficient answer to moral questions, even if doesn't eliminate them entirely. April 15th, 1917. Vimy Ridge, France. The temperature was 4 degrees Celsius, and rain was falling when Lance Corporal Francis Pegamagabo lay motionless in a shell crater, pretending to be dead. Pegamagabo was 27 years old, an Ojibwe sniper from Parry Island, Ontario, serving with the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion, and he had been lying in no man's land for 38 hours without moving. German soldiers had passed within 2 meters of his position 3 times. Each time, Pegamagabo controlled his breathing and remained perfectly still. The Germans saw what they expected to see, another dead Canadian among the hundreds of dead Canadians scattered across Vimy Ridge. They kept walking. Pegamagabo had 3 more days to survive before he could attempt to crawl back to Canadian lines. Francis Pegamagabo came from the Parry Island First Nation on Georgian Bay. His parents died when he was 3 years old. He was raised by his grandfather, Noah Nebemanequad, who taught him traditional Ojibwe hunting and tracking skills. Pegamagabo learned to move silently through forests, to read animal signs, to wait motionless for hours while hunting deer. By age 15, he could track wounded deer across kilometers of rough terrain and could approach within meters of game without being detected. These skills were developed for survival and feeding his community. He never imagined they would be used for war. When World War I began in August 1914, Pegamagabo was 23 years old and working as a guide and hunter near Parry Sound. Indigenous Canadians were not required to enlist. They were not even considered full citizens under Canadian law in 1914. But Pegamagabo volunteered anyway in August 1914. He joined the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion and shipped to England for training. The Canadian military didn't know what to do with Indigenous soldiers initially. Pegamagabo was assigned to standard infantry training, drill, rifle practice, trench tactics.
He was adequate at drill and excellent at rifle practice. His instructors noted that Pegamagabo could shoot accurately at ranges that most soldiers couldn't even see targets. In February 1915, the 1st Battalion deployed to France. Pegamagabo experienced his first combat at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. German forces used poison gas for the first time. Canadian forces held their positions despite being gassed and suffering massive casualties. Pegamagabo survived the battle and was noted in battalion records as having remained calm under artillery fire and gas attack. What the records didn't note was that Pegamagabo had killed 17 German soldiers during the battle using his rifle. He didn't report this number. He simply did his job. By late 1915, Pegamagabo's battalion commander recognized that Pegamagabo had unusual skills. He could move silently through trenches. He could identify German positions by observing small details, disturbed earth, reflection off metal, movement patterns. He could shoot accurately at extreme ranges. The commander assigned Pegamagabo to sniper duties. Pegamagabo was given a Ross rifle with telescopic sight and authorized to operate independently in no man's land. Sniping in World War I was different from later wars. There were no established sniper schools or standardized tactics. Snipers developed their own methods through trial and error. Pegamagabo applied his hunting skills directly. He would study German trench lines for hours, identifying patterns in sentry rotations and weak points in defenses. He would crawl into no man's land at night, find a concealed position, and wait motionless for hours or days until a target appeared. Then he would take one shot and immediately relocate before German forces could identify his position. Between 1915 and 1917, Pegamagabo killed 378 German soldiers. This number was documented by his battalion through confirmed kills, instances where Canadian observers verified that Pegamagabo's shot had killed a specific German soldier. The actual number was likely higher because many kills couldn't be confirmed.
Pegamagabo became the most effective sniper in Canadian military history and one of the most effective in the entire British Empire forces during World War I. But effectiveness came with cost. German forces hated snipers and made them priority targets. If a sniper was captured, execution was common. If a sniper position was identified, artillery bombardment would target that position intensely. Pegamagabo understood these risks and managed them carefully. He never used the same position twice. He never took more than 2 shots from any location. He always established multiple escape routes before taking a shot. On April 9, 1917, the Battle of Vimy Ridge began. Canadian forces were tasked with capturing Vimy Ridge, a strategic position that French and British forces had failed to capture despite 2 years of attempts. The Canadian plan involved massive artillery preparation followed by infantry assault. Pegamagabo's role was to advance ahead of infantry and eliminate German machine gun positions that would threaten the assault. At 0530 hours on April 9th, Pegamagabo crawled into no man's land, while Canadian artillery bombarded German positions. The bombardment was so intense that the ground shook continuously. Pegamagabo used the artillery noise to cover his movement. He crawled 200 meters across broken ground, avoiding shell craters and barbed wire until he reached a position 50 meters from German frontline trenches. He found a shell crater partially filled with mud and positioned himself inside it with his rifle aimed at a German machine gun position. At 0540 hours, the Canadian artillery shifted to a rolling barrage, moving deeper into German positions. Canadian infantry began their assault. German machine guns opened fire. Pegamagabo could see 3 German machine gun teams in their positions. He shot the first machine gunner at 0542 hours. The German fell. Another German soldier moved to operate the machine gun. Pegamagabo shot him at 0543 hours. The machine gun went silent. Pegamagabo shifted his aim to the second machine gun position. He shot that gunner at 0544 hours. The gun went silent. He was shifting to the third position when German artillery began counter-bombardment. A shell exploded 15 meters from Pegamagabo's crater. Shrapnel hit his left shoulder and side. Pegamagabo was knocked backward into the mud. He felt immediate pain and wetness, blood soaking his uniform. He checked his wounds. Shrapnel had penetrated his shoulder and side, but hadn't hit major arteries. He was bleeding, but not critically. He could still move. The Canadian infantry assault was continuing around him, soldiers advancing past his position toward German trenches. Pegamagabo tried to stand and follow them, but his legs wouldn't support his weight. He had lost too much blood. He collapsed back into the crater. German artillery continued bombarding the area. Shells exploded continuously. Pegamagabo understood his situation. He was wounded and unable to walk. Canadian infantry had advanced past his position. German forces would counterattack and likely retake this ground. If German soldiers found him alive and identified him as a sniper, they would execute him. His only option was to hide and hope Canadian forces maintained control of this area long enough for him to be rescued. Pegamagabo had one advantage. He was Ojibwe and had been trained since childhood to survive in hostile environments. He assessed his resources. He had his rifle with approximately 40 rounds remaining. He had a canteen with water. He had no food. He had a small medical kit with bandages. He was lying in a shell crater in no man's land with German and Canadian forces fighting around him. He made a decision. He would hide in the crater and pretend to be dead until either Canadian forces secured the area or he recovered enough strength to crawl back to Canadian lines. He used his bandages to bind his wounds and slow the bleeding. Then he covered himself partially with mud and positioned himself to appear like just another casualty. He placed his rifle underneath his body where it wouldn't be visible. Then he lay completely still. German artillery bombardment continued for 3 hours. Shells exploded around Pegamagabo's crater,
but none hit directly. At 0900 hours, the bombardment stopped. Pegamagabo could hear German voices, soldiers counterattacking, trying to retake positions captured by Canadian forces. He heard boots approaching his crater. He controlled his breathing and remained motionless. 3 German soldiers approached. They were searching the area, checking bodies for intelligence documents and weapons. One soldier stopped at Pegamagabo's crater and looked down. Pegamagabo kept his eyes partially open. Closed eyes looked suspicious on a fresh corpse. He stared without focusing, letting his eyes appear glazed. The German soldier stared at him for several seconds. Then the soldier moved on. Pegamagabo had passed his first test. Over the next 12 hours, German and Canadian forces fought for control of the area around Pegamagabo's crater. The front line shifted back and forth. At times, German forces controlled the ground around him. At times, Canadian forces controlled it. Pegamagabo remained motionless through all of this. He didn't move when shells exploded nearby. He didn't move when soldiers walked past. He didn't move when rats crawled on him, investigating whether he was actually dead. By nightfall on April 9th, Canadian forces had secured most of Vimy Ridge, but the area around Pegamagabo's crater remained contested.
Pegamagabo was thirsty, but couldn't risk drinking from his canteen while soldiers might be watching. He was in pain from his wounds, but couldn't risk moving to adjust his position. He simply lay still and endured. April 10th brought rain, cold rain that filled the crater partially with water. Pegamagabo lay in cold water mixed with blood and mud, unable to move without risking discovery. German patrols passed his position twice during the day. Each time, Pegamagabo held his breath and remained perfectly still. Each time, the Germans saw a dead Canadian in a crater and kept moving. By April 11th, Pegamagabo had been lying in the crater for 50 hours. His wounds had stopped bleeding, but were beginning to show signs of infection. He was extremely thirsty. He was cold. He was starting to experience hallucinations from dehydration and blood loss. But he remained disciplined. He knew that moving before the area was secure would mean death. On the night of April 11th, Pegamagabo heard Canadian voices. A patrol was searching the area, checking for wounded. Pegamagabo waited until he was certain they were Canadian. He verified their accents and vocabulary. Then he moved slightly and groaned. The movement sent pain through his body, but it worked. A Canadian soldier noticed the movement and called out, "Wounded here!" 2 soldiers approached the crater carefully, unsure if Pegamagabo was actually Canadian or if this was a German trap. Pegamagabo spoke in English. "Lance Corporal Pegamagabo, 1st Battalion. Been here since the 9th. The soldiers were shocked. "You've been lying here for 2.5 days." "Yes." They helped him out of the crater. Pegamagabo tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. The soldiers carried him back to Canadian lines on a stretcher. At the battalion aid station, the medical officer examined his wounds. The shrapnel wounds were infected, but not critically. The officer asked how Pegamagabo survived 2.5 days in no man's land without being discovered or killed. Pegamagabo said, "I learned to wait when I was young. Hunting deer, you wait until the right moment. Same principle." The medical officer didn't fully understand, but noted in his report, Lance Corporal Pegamagabo recovered from no man's land after 60 hours. Wounds infected, but survivable. Remarkable endurance and discipline. Pegamagabo was evacuated to a field hospital for treatment. His wounds required 3 weeks to heal. During this time, he learned that the Battle of Vimy Ridge had been a complete Canadian victory. All objectives captured. German forces pushed back. Vimy Ridge was now under Canadian control. Pegamagabo had contributed to this victory by eliminating 3 machine gun positions in the critical early minutes of the assault. His battalion commander recommended him for a medal. Pegamagabo received the military medal for his actions at Vimy Ridge. The citation mentioned conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty, but didn't mention the 60 hours spent pretending to be dead in no man's land. Military citations rarely captured the full reality of what soldiers endured. By June 1917, Pegamagabo had recovered and returned to his battalion. He resumed sniper duties. Between June 1917 and November 1918, he killed an additional 280 German soldiers, bringing his total to 378 confirmed kills. He also captured 300 German soldiers, instances where he approached German positions so stealthily that he could capture soldiers before they realized he was there. But the 60 hours at Vimy Ridge had changed something in Pegamagabo. He had learned that he could survive situations that would kill most men. He had learned that the hunting skills his grandfather taught him were more effective in war than any military training. And he had learned that pretending to be dead was sometimes the best survival tactic available. This knowledge would be tested again. October 30th, 1917, Passchendaele, Belgium. 6 months after Vimy Ridge, Pegamagabo found himself in an even worse situation. The Battle of Passchendaele had turned the Belgian landscape into a swamp. Constant rain and artillery bombardment had destroyed all drainage systems. The ground was liquid mud in many places, deep enough to drown men who fell into shell craters. Pegamagabo was advancing with his battalion toward German positions when German machine gun fire erupted from a concrete pillbox 80 meters ahead. Pegamagabo dropped into a shell crater for cover. The crater was filled with waist-deep water. 3 other Canadian soldiers were already in the crater, also taking cover. The machine gun fire was so intense that anyone who tried to leave the crater was cut down immediately. They were pinned. Pegamagabo assessed the situation. The pillbox was too well positioned to assault directly. Artillery support wasn't available. Canadian artillery was focused on other objectives. They needed to eliminate that machine gun, or the entire battalion advance would stall. Pegamagabo told the other 3 soldiers, "Stay here. Keep the machine gun's attention. I'll approach from the flank." One soldier said, "You can't cross that ground. They'll kill you." "They'll kill you if you're moving," Pegamagabo said. "They won't see you if you're not." Pegamagabo waited until the machine gun shifted its fire to target other Canadian soldiers approaching from a different angle. Then he climbed out of the crater and lay flat in the mud. He didn't crawl, he slivered, moving so slowly and staying so flat that he was indistinguishable from the churned mud and debris covering the battlefield. He moved 5 meters in 10 minutes. Then he stopped and waited motionless for another 10 minutes, watching the machine gun's field of fire. The German gunners were focused on obvious threats: soldiers moving quickly, soldiers in groups, soldiers firing back. They didn't notice a single shape lying perfectly still in the mud 75 meters away. Pegamagabo moved another 5 meters, stopped, waited, moved again. Over the course of 2 hours, he covered 60 meters, bringing him within 20 meters of the pillbox. From this position, Pegamagabo could see the machine gun firing port. He could see the German gunner's silhouette. He slowly, carefully positioned his rifle. He aimed. He waited for the gunner to pause reloading. The gunner paused. Pegamagabo fired. The gunner fell. The machine gun went silent. German soldiers inside the pillbox scrambled to replace the dead gunner. Pegamagabo shot the replacement. Then he shot a 3rd German who tried to operate the gun. The Germans inside the pillbox realized they were being targeted by a sniper, but couldn't identify his position. Pegamagabo was covered in mud, lying flat in terrain that looked like churned earth and debris. He was invisible. The Germans did what Pegamagabo expected. They threw grenades in the general direction they thought the sniper might be. The grenades exploded around Pegamagabo's position. One exploded 5 meters away, showering him with mud and shrapnel. He was hit again, shrapnel in his leg and back. Pain exploded through his body, but he didn't move.
Moving would reveal his position and bring more grenades. Pegamagabo lay motionless as blood soaked into the mud beneath him. He could hear German voices from the pillbox arguing about where the sniper was. He could hear Canadian forces advancing now that the machine gun was silent. He wanted to signal to Canadian forces that he was wounded and needed help, but signaling would reveal his position to Germans who might still throw grenades. He made a decision. He would stay motionless until Canadian forces captured the pillbox. Then he would identify himself.
He lay in the mud, wounded, bleeding, while battle raged around him. Canadian forces assaulted the pillbox from multiple directions. German forces inside surrendered after 10 minutes of fighting. Canadian soldiers secured the pillbox and began searching the area. Pegamagabo waited until he saw Canadian soldiers approaching his position. Then he moved his hand slightly and called out weakly, "Canadian wounded here." Soldiers rushed to him. They were shocked to find a Canadian soldier lying 20 meters from a German pillbox, covered in mud, barely visible. They carefully lifted him and saw the blood. "Medic!" one soldier shouted. A medic examined Pegamagabo's wounds, shrapnel in leg and back, similar to Vimy Ridge but in different locations. The medic asked how long Pegamagabo had been lying there. Pegamagabo said 2.5 hours since being wounded. The medic said most men would have screamed or tried to crawl away when hit by shrapnel. Pegamagabo said screaming or moving would have brought more grenades. They evacuated Pegamagabo to a field hospital. Again, his wounds required weeks to heal. Again, his battalion commander recommended him for a medal. This time, Pegamagabo received a bar to his military medal, a second award. The citation mentioned exceptional skill as a scout and sniper, but again didn't fully describe what had happened. Pegamagabo returned to duty in January 1918. He continued sniping operations through the final year of the war. His methods never changed. Patient observation, silent movement, 1 or 2 shots maximum, immediate relocation. These methods kept him alive when many other snipers were killed. By November 1918, when the war ended, Pegamagabo had survived 4 years of combat, been wounded multiple times, and killed 378 German soldiers. The statistics were extraordinary, but what made Pegamagabo remarkable wasn't just the numbers, it was the method. He had taken traditional Ojibwe hunting skills developed over generations for survival and food gathering, and applied them to warfare with devastating effectiveness. The Canadian military never fully understood this. They saw Pegamagabo as an exceptionally skilled sniper, but didn't understand that his effectiveness came from a completely different knowledge system than European military training provided. After the war ended, Pegamagabo returned to Canada in 1919. He was 29 years old and had served longer in frontline combat than most soldiers survived. He returned to Parry Island and tried to resume normal life. This proved difficult. The Canadian government's treatment of Indigenous veterans was shameful. Despite having served with distinction, Indigenous veterans were denied many benefits available to non-Indigenous veterans. Pegamagabo had been one of Canada's most effective soldiers, but was not considered a full citizen under Canadian law. Pegamagabo spent the next 30 years fighting for Indigenous rights. He became chief of the Parry Island Band and later Supreme Chief of the Native Independent Government. He advocated for treaty rights, land rights, and proper recognition of Indigenous veterans. This work was frustrating and often unsuccessful. The Canadian government was resistant to Indigenous self-determination, but Pegamagabo continued fighting because he understood persistence. He had learned it hunting deer as a boy and had applied it to war. The same patience he used lying motionless in shell craters for days, he applied to political advocacy. In 1949, the Canadian government finally granted Indigenous people the right to vote in federal elections, 34 years after World War I ended. Pegamagabo was 59 years old. He had been fighting for indigenous rights longer than he had fought in the war. He told a journalist that getting the vote took more persistence than any military operation he had conducted. In war, you can see the enemy.
In politics, the enemy is invisible systems and attitudes. That's harder to fight. During these decades, Pagamagabo rarely spoke about his war service. When asked, he would acknowledge that he served as a sniper, but provided no details about the 378 confirmed kills or the multiple instances of lying wounded in no man's land pretending to be dead. He didn't see his military service as the most important thing he had done. He saw his post-war advocacy work as more significant because it potentially benefited entire communities rather than individual soldiers. Pagamagabo died on August 5, 1952, at age 61 from heart failure. His obituary in the Parry Sound newspaper mentioned his military service and his work as chief of Parry Island Band, but didn't mention that he was the most effective sniper in Canadian military history. This information wasn't widely known at the time. The Canadian military had records of Pagamagabo's confirmed kills, but these records weren't publicized. Pagamagabo was buried at Parry Island with traditional Ojibwe ceremonies. For decades after his death, Pagamagabo remained largely unknown, except to military historians who studied sniper effectiveness. But in the 1980s and 1990s, there was renewed interest in indigenous contributions to Canadian military history. Researchers discovered Pagamagabo's military records and were shocked by what they found. The German perspective. In 1987, a German military historian named Klaus Schreiber was researching German casualty records from World War I. Schreiber had access to German military archives that documented losses by unit, date, and, when possible, cause of death. Schreiber noticed an unusual pattern in casualty records from sectors where Canadian forces operated between 1915 to 1918. Specifically, there were sectors where German casualties from sniper fire were significantly higher than average. Schreiber cross-referenced these sectors with Canadian military records and discovered that the highest German sniper casualties occurred in sectors where the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion operated. Further investigation revealed references to a single Canadian sniper who was particularly effective. German intelligence reports from 1917 mentioned ein kanadischer Scharfschütze von außergewöhnlicher Fähigkeit, a Canadian sniper of exceptional ability. The reports noted that this sniper could remain undetected for extended periods and could shoot accurately at ranges exceeding typical sniper engagements. Schreiber wanted to identify this Canadian sniper. He contacted Canadian military archives and was directed to Pagamagabo's service records. Schreiber was stunned by what he found. 378 confirmed kills, multiple instances of solo operations deep in German-held territory, capture of 300 German soldiers. These numbers exceeded any other sniper in Canadian or British Empire forces during World War I. Schreiber wrote to Pagamagabo's surviving family in 1988, asking if any family members would be willing to discuss Pagamagabo's military service from a historical perspective. Pagamagabo's grandson, William Pagamagabo Jr., responded. William Jr. was 42 years old and had grown up hearing occasional stories about his grandfather, but had never fully understood the scope of his grandfather's military effectiveness. Schreiber traveled to Parry Island in 1989 to meet William Jr. Schreiber brought copies of German casualty records and intelligence reports from World War I. He showed William Jr. the German intelligence reports mentioning the exceptional Canadian sniper who operated in their sectors. He showed casualty statistics demonstrating that German losses to sniper fire increased dramatically when Pagamagabo was operating in a sector. Your grandfather was responsible for approximately 400 German deaths during the war, Schreiber said. That's not counting the 300 he captured. From the German perspective, he was one of the most dangerous individuals we faced. William Jr. asked how German forces tried to counter Pagamagabo. Schreiber explained that German forces never successfully identified or countered him because they couldn't find him.
Traditional counter-sniper tactics involve identifying the sniper's position and either eliminating him with artillery or sending your own snipers to kill him. Your grandfather never stayed in one position long enough to be identified. German reports describe him as ghost-like. He would appear, take shots, and disappear before we could respond. William Jr. said his grandfather rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, he mentioned learning to be still. He said the most important skill was knowing when not to move. He learned this hunting deer as a boy. The deer would be close, but if you moved too soon, the deer would run. You waited until exactly the right moment. He said war was the same. Wait until the right moment, then act decisively. Schreiber asked if Pegah had ever expressed regret about killing so many German soldiers. William Jr. thought carefully. My grandfather didn't talk about killing Germans as accomplishment or as regret. He talked about it as survival. He was in a situation where killing enemy soldiers was necessary to survive and to protect Canadian soldiers around him. He did what was necessary. After the war, he focused on other things: advocacy for indigenous rights, supporting his community. The war was something that happened. It didn't define him. Schreiber mentioned the instances where Pegah lay wounded in no man's land, pretending to be dead. German reports mention finding dead Canadian soldiers who later turned out to be alive. We never understood how some soldiers could survive days in no man's land without moving. Your grandfather did this multiple times. How? William Jr. explained what his grandfather had told him. Ojibwe hunters learned to be still, completely still, breathing controlled, no fidgeting, no movement even when uncomfortable or in pain. This skill takes years to develop. My grandfather learned it as a child and practiced it his entire life. For him, lying motionless for days was difficult, but not impossible. It was an extension of skills he already had. From the German perspective, Schreiber said, your grandfather was fighting a different kind of war than we were trained for. European military tactics in 1914 to 1918 were based on formations, artillery, machine guns, trenches. Your grandfather was fighting individually, using skills from a completely different tradition. We had no effective counter to that. Schreiber and William Jr. corresponded for several years. Schreiber provided German military documents related to sectors where Pegah operated. William Jr. provided family stories and context about Ojibwe traditions that informed his grandfather's approach to warfare. In 1995, Schreiber published a book titled Indigenous Warriors: Native American Contributions to Allied Victory in World War I. The book included a chapter about Pegah, describing him as possibly the most effective individual combat soldier on the Western Front. The book's publication led to increased recognition of Pegah's military service. In 2003, Canada Post issued a commemorative stamp featuring Pegah. In 2016, the Canadian government posthumously designated Pegah a Person of National Historic Significance. A memorial was erected at Parry Island, honoring his military service and his advocacy work. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from William Jr.'s efforts to document his grandfather's full story. William Jr. spent years interviewing elders from Parry Island who had known Pegah, collecting oral histories and combining these with military records to create a complete picture of his grandfather's life. What emerged was a complex portrait. A man who was extraordinarily effective at warfare, but didn't define himself by warfare. A man who killed 378 enemy soldiers, but spent more time and energy advocating peacefully for indigenous rights. A man who could lie motionless in freezing mud for days, but chose to spend most of his life working patiently through political systems to achieve change. The lesson. The lesson from Francis Pegah story is not primarily about sniping or military tactics. It is about the value of knowledge systems that exist outside mainstream military traditions. European military forces in World War I had developed elaborate doctrines for infantry warfare, artillery, logistics, command structures. These doctrines were based on centuries of European military experience. They were sophisticated and effective within their framework. But Pegamagabo operated outside this framework. His effectiveness came from skills developed over generations of Ojibwe hunting and survival traditions. These skills, silent movement, patient observation, stillness under stress, reading terrain, understanding wind and weather, were developed for entirely different purposes than warfare. But when applied to warfare, they proved devastatingly effective. The Canadian military benefited from Pegamagabo's skills, but never fully understood them. They saw him as an exceptional individual, rather than as someone drawing on a deep knowledge tradition. After the war, when Pegamagabo advocated for Indigenous rights and recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems, the Canadian government was resistant. They had been willing to use Indigenous skills in warfare, but were not willing to respect Indigenous knowledge in peacetime. Pegamagabo understood this irony.
He had saved countless Canadian lives through his sniping effectiveness. He had been wounded multiple times fighting for Canada, yet after the war, he was denied full citizenship rights and had to fight for decades to achieve basic recognition of Indigenous treaty rights. He told a journalist in 1948, "In war, Canada wanted my skills. In peace, Canada wants to forget I exist." This tells you what Canada values. This bitterness was justified, but Pegamagabo didn't let it stop him from continuing his advocacy work. The same persistence that kept him alive, lying wounded in shell craters, the same patience he learned hunting deer as a boy, he applied to political advocacy. Progress was slow, but Pegamagabo maintained pressure consistently for 30 years, until finally achieving some recognition of Indigenous voting rights before he died. The connection between his childhood hunting skills and his war effectiveness, and his post-war advocacy, is not coincidental. All three drew on the same fundamental approach: careful observation, patient waiting, acting at the right moment, persistence despite hardship. These were Ojibwe values and skills passed down through generations. Pegamagabo applied them to different contexts: hunting, warfare, politics, but the underlying approach remained consistent. When Schreiber asked William Jr. what his grandfather would want people to know about his war service, William Jr. said he would want people to know that Indigenous knowledge systems are valuable, not just for warfare, for everything. The same skills that made him an effective warrior made him an effective advocate and an effective community leader. These skills came from Ojibwe traditions that Canada spent most of its history trying to destroy through residential schools and assimilation policies. My grandfather proved those traditions had value. He survived situations that killed most soldiers because of knowledge his grandfather taught him. That's what he would want remembered. Not the 378 kills, but the knowledge tradition that made those kills possible, and that also made his advocacy work possible. Francis Pegamagabo lay motionless in shell craters for days, wounded and surrounded by enemies, because his grandfather had taught him how to wait while hunting deer. He killed 378 enemy soldiers because his grandfather had taught him how to move silently and shoot accurately. He advocated successfully for Indigenous rights because his grandfather had taught him patience and persistence. All of this came from the same source: Ojibwe knowledge passed across generations. The Canadian military used this knowledge when convenient, but didn't respect its origins. Pegamagabo spent his life demonstrating that Indigenous knowledge systems deserved respect, not just for military purposes, but as complete, sophisticated approaches to life that had value in all contexts. Sometimes the most effective approach to a problem comes from outside the established systems. Sometimes the skills developed for one purpose prove unexpectedly valuable in completely different contexts. Sometimes the knowledge that mainstream society dismisses or tries to destroy
turns out to be more effective than the mainstream knowledge itself. Pegamagabo understood all of this. He lived it, and he tried to teach it through both his military service and his post-war advocacy. Whether people learned the lesson is a different question, but the lesson was there, demonstrated through 378 confirmed kills and 30 years of patient advocacy and a lifetime of applying Ojibwe wisdom to whatever challenges he faced.
August 18th, 1944, Normandy, France, 8 kilometers south of Falaise. The temperature was 22 degrees Celsius, and smoke from burning vehicles filled the air when Major David Curry watched his tank explode. Curry was 26 years old, commander of a Sherman tank with the South Alberta Regiment, and he had exactly 3 seconds to evacuate before ammunition cooked off and turned the tank into a death trap. He shouted to his crew, "Bail out!" They tumbled out of hatches as flames engulfed the tank. Curry hit the ground and rolled into a ditch 10 meters away. The tank exploded, sending the turret 15 meters into the air. Curry and his 4-man crew were alive, but their tank was destroyed. They were now infantry in the middle of a tank battle. David Curry came from Sutherland, Saskatchewan. His father was a farmer who worked 160 acres of wheat and cattle. Curry grew up operating farm machinery, tractors, combines, trucks. By age 16, he could repair diesel engines and diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone. These skills were developed for farming, but would prove unexpectedly useful in warfare. Curry enlisted in 1939, when war began, and was assigned to the South Alberta Regiment, an armored unit equipped with tanks. He trained on various tank models and proved naturally talented at both operating and maintaining armored vehicles. By August 1944, Curry had been fighting in Normandy for 2 months since D-Day. The South Alberta Regiment was equipped with M4 Sherman tanks, American-made medium tanks that were reliable but outmatched by German armor. Sherman tanks weighed 30 tons and had 75mm guns. German Panther tanks weighed 45 tons and had 75mm guns with superior range and penetration. German Tiger tanks weighed 57 tons and had 88mm guns that could destroy Shermans from distances Shermans couldn't effectively return fire. Allied tank crews understood they were fighting in inferior vehicles. They compensated with numbers, coordination, and tactics. On August 18th, Curry's squadron was advancing toward the town of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive as part of the effort to close the Falaise pocket, a pocket where German forces were being surrounded by Allied armies. German forces were attempting to break out of the pocket while Allied forces were trying to close it. The area was chaos. German and Allied forces were intermixed. Roads were clogged with burning vehicles, abandoned equipment, and casualties. Curry's tank was advancing along a road when German Panther tanks appeared 800 meters ahead. The Panthers opened fire. Curry's tank was hit immediately. A Panther's 75mm shell penetrated the Sherman's frontal armor and ignited ammunition stored inside. Curry ordered evacuation, and his crew bailed out seconds before the tank exploded. They survived, but were now on foot in an active battlefield. Curry assessed the situation. He and his crew, gunner Corporal James Mitchell, driver Private Robert Walsh, loader Private Thomas Henderson, radio operator Private William Fraser, were armed with pistols and 1 submachine gun. German Panther tanks controlled the road ahead. Allied forces were approximately 2 kilometers behind them. Retreating on foot across 2 kilometers of open ground under fire seemed suicidal. Curry looked for alternatives. Approximately 100 meters to the left, partially concealed in a grove of trees, Curry saw a German Panther tank. The Panther appeared abandoned. No crew visible, engine not running, hatches open. Curry had a wild idea. He told his crew, "We're taking that Panther." Mitchell said, "Sir, that's a German tank." I'm aware, Curry said. We can't walk back and we can't stay here. We take the Panther and drive to Allied lines. Walsh said, do you know how to operate a Panther? It's a tank. Same basic principles as a Sherman. We'll figure it out. Henderson said, if we're driving a German tank toward Allied lines, our own forces will shoot us. One problem at a time, Curry said. The 5 Canadians approached the Panther carefully, weapons ready, expecting Germans to be nearby. The Panther was completely abandoned. Curry examined the tank. It appeared mechanically intact. No visible damage, no fire, no destroyed components. The crew had simply abandoned it, possibly during a retreat or after running out of ammunition. Curry climbed into the commander's cupola and examined the interior. The Panther's layout was different from a Sherman, but recognizable. Commander's position, gunner's position, driver's position, loader's position, radio operator's position. The controls were labeled in German, but tank controls were relatively standardized. Throttle, gears, steering levers, gun controls. Curry had operated multiple tank models during training. He understood the principles. He could figure out the specifics. He called his crew. Mitchell, you're gunner. Walsh, driver's position. Henderson, loader. Fraser, radio. Get in. The crew climbed into the Panther. It was roomier than a Sherman. German tanks were designed with more internal space. Walsh settled into the driver's seat and examined the controls. Everything was labeled in German. Kupplung, clutch, Bremse, brake, gas, throttle. Walsh had learned some German in school. He could work with this. Curry examined the ammunition storage. The Panther had approximately 15 rounds of 75mm ammunition remaining, enough for defensive use if necessary. The fuel gauge showed half full, approximately 300 litres of fuel remaining, enough for perhaps 100 kilometres of travel. Everything looked functional. Curry said, Walsh, start the engine. Walsh located the ignition and turned it. The Panther's Maybach engine turned over and started with a deep rumble. The engine was louder than a Sherman's engine, and the vibration felt different, but it was running smoothly. Walsh tested the controls, clutch, gears, steering levers. Everything responded. He said, engine's operational, sir. I can drive this, Curry said. Henderson, load 1 round, just in case. Henderson located a 75mm round and loaded it into the gun's breech. The loading mechanism was slightly different from a Sherman, but the principle was the same. The round loaded successfully. Curry examined the Panther's radio. It was a German Fu 5 radio set, completely different from Allied radios. Curry couldn't operate it, and communicating with Allied forces using a German radio would be impossible anyway. He told Fraser, radio's useless to us. Focus on watching for threats. Curry climbed into the commander's cupola and looked at the battlefield. German forces were approximately 800 meters to the east. He could see Panther tanks still engaging Allied forces. Allied lines were approximately 2 kilometers to the west. To reach Allied lines, they needed to drive 2 kilometers in a German tank through a battlefield where both sides would potentially shoot at them. German forces would shoot at them if they realized the Panther was crewed by Canadians. Allied forces would shoot at them because they appeared to be a German tank approaching Allied positions. This was possibly the stupidest plan Curry had ever conceived, but staying put meant being captured or killed. Retreating on foot meant being shot crossing open ground. Driving a captured German tank toward friendly lines was risky, but seemed like the best available option. Curry made his decision. Walsh, drive west toward Allied lines. Keep speed moderate, don't make sudden movements. If we get fired on by Germans, we keep driving. If we get fired on by Allies, we stop immediately and bail out. Clear? Clear, sir. Let's go. Walsh engaged the transmission and the Panther lurched forward. The tank was heavier than a Sherman and handled differently.
Slower acceleration, wider turning radius, but smoother ride. Walsh drove the Panther out of the tree cover and onto the road heading west. For the first 200 meters, nothing happened. The Panther drove along the road unmolested. Curry started to think they might actually get away with this. Then, German infantry appeared ahead, approximately 30 soldiers retreating west along the same road. The German soldiers saw the Panther approaching and waved, assuming it was a friendly tank. Some soldiers moved to the side of the road to let the Panther pass. Others called out in German, asking if the tank could provide covering fire. Curry faced a decision. If he ignored the German soldiers, they would realize something was wrong. If he responded in German, his accent would reveal him immediately. If he fired on the German soldiers, it would alert every German unit in the area. Curry decided on a different approach. He waved back at the German soldiers casually and kept driving. The Panther passed the German infantry without stopping. The German soldiers looked confused, but didn't immediately react with hostility. They appeared to assume the Panther commander was focused on a specific mission and couldn't stop to help. Curry and his crew passed approximately 100 meters beyond the German infantry when one of the Germans shouted something. Curry couldn't hear clearly, but the tone sounded suspicious. He said to Walsh, "Increase speed. They're figuring it out." Walsh accelerated. The Panther's speed increased from 15 to 25 kilometers per hour. Behind them, German soldiers began shouting. A few shots were fired, rifle fire that pinged off the Panther's heavy armor ineffectively. German infantry couldn't threaten the Panther with small arms, but they could alert German armor or anti-tank units. Curry said, "Keep driving. Don't stop." The Panther continued west at 25 kilometers per hour. After another 300 meters, Curry saw a more serious problem ahead, a German anti-tank gun position. The position had a PaK 40 75mm anti-tank gun capable of penetrating a Panther's armor at this range. The gun crew was watching the Panther approach. Curry had seconds to decide. Try to talk their way past the anti-tank position or engage it with the Panther's gun. If he tried talking, the anti-tank crew would likely realize quickly that something was wrong. If he engaged, it would alert every German unit in the area that this Panther was hostile. Curry made the harder choice. He told Mitchell, "Gunner, target the anti-tank gun. Fire when ready." Mitchell traversed the turret toward the PaK 40 position and aimed. The German anti-tank crew saw the Panther's gun turning toward them and panicked. They scattered from their gun position. Mitchell fired. The 75mm round hit the PaK 40 directly, destroying it. The explosion was enormous. The German crew that had scattered was now running away from the destroyed gun. Curry said, "Keep driving. We just announced ourselves to every German in the area." The Panther accelerated to 30 kilometers per hour, close to its maximum road speed. Behind them, Curry could hear German voices shouting and vehicle engines starting. German forces were reacting. Ahead, Curry estimated they were now approximately 1.5 kilometers from Allied lines. They needed to cover that distance before German armor caught up, or before they drove into Allied anti-tank positions. At 1 kilometer from Allied lines, Curry saw both problems simultaneously. Behind them, a German Panther tank appeared on the road, approximately 600 meters back, and began pursuing. Ahead, Allied positions became visible. Canadian infantry in defensive positions with visible anti-tank guns. The pursuing German Panther fired. The shot missed Curry's Panther by 3 meters, exploding in the field beside the road. Curry was now being chased by Germans from behind while approaching Allies who would almost certainly fire at what appeared to be a German tank attacking their position. Curry made a desperate decision. He told Fraser, "Grab anything white, shirt, cloth, anything. We need to signal we're friendly." Fraser found a white undershirt in his pack and handed it to Curry. Curry climbed partially out of the commander's cupola, waving the white shirt frantically, while the Panther continued driving at 30 kilometers per hour toward Allied lines. Behind them, the pursuing German Panther fired again. The shot hit Curry's Panther in the rear armor, penetrating the engine compartment. The engine began smoking, but kept running. Ahead, Canadian infantry saw a German Panther approaching, with someone waving a white shirt from the commander's hatch. This made no sense. German tanks didn't surrender by driving at Canadian positions at 30 kilometers per hour. The Canadian anti-tank crews hesitated, unsure whether to fire. Curry was now 400 meters from Allied lines. The engine was smoking heavily and losing power. The pursuing German Panther was 500 meters behind and closing. Curry screamed at the top of his lungs toward Allied positions. "Canadian tank! Don't shoot! Canadian crew!" Curry was 300 meters from Allied lines when Canadian infantry finally understood what was happening. A lieutenant in the forward positions recognized Curry's voice. They had been in the same regiment for 2 years. The lieutenant shouted to his anti-tank crews, "Hold fire! That's Major Curry! Hold fire!" The Canadian anti-tank guns didn't fire. Curry's smoking Panther crossed into Allied lines at 0940 hours on August 18, 1944. Behind them, the pursuing German Panther stopped at 600 meters and withdrew rather than approaching Allied anti-tank positions. Curry's Panther rolled another 50 meters into Canadian-held territory before the damaged engine seized completely and stopped. Curry and his crew climbed out of the Panther. They were surrounded immediately by Canadian infantry, who stared in disbelief. A captain approached Curry and said, "Sir, did you just drive a captured German tank through enemy lines into our position?" "Yes," Curry said. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen." It was that or walk. Canadian mechanics examined the Panther. The German round had penetrated the engine compartment and damaged the cooling system. The engine had overheated and seized. The tank was immobile, but otherwise intact. The mechanics said with repairs, the Panther could be made operational again. Curry asked if Canadian forces could use a captured Panther. The mechanics said, absolutely. Panthers were superior to Shermans in almost every way. Having a Panther would be valuable for testing, for understanding German capabilities, and potentially for combat if it could be disguised or used carefully. Curry's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Wotherspoon, arrived to debrief Curry. Wotherspoon was 42 years old and had commanded the South Alberta Regiment since 1943. He listened to Curry describe stealing the Panther, driving it through German lines, being chased by German armor, and arriving at Allied positions. Wotherspoon said, "Major Curry, that was either brilliant improvisation or complete insanity." "Probably both, sir." "Did you consider the risks of being shot by our own anti-tank guns?" "Yes, sir, but staying in German territory seemed riskier." Wotherspoon shook his head. "You're either very lucky or very skilled. Probably both. I'm recommending you for a decoration." Over the following days, the captured Panther was repaired and tested. Canadian mechanics replaced the damaged cooling system and got the engine running again. The Panther was test-fired and examined thoroughly. Canadian tank crews were fascinated. The Panther's 75mm gun had superior range and penetration compared to Sherman guns. The armor was thicker, the optics were better. The only significant advantage Shermans had was reliability. Shermans broke down less frequently than Panthers. Canadian intelligence officers interrogated Curry extensively about the Panther's capabilities. Curry described the controls, the handling characteristics, the gun performance. This information was valuable for understanding how German armor operated and for developing tactics to fight against Panthers more effectively. In early September 1944, Curry was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest British Empire military decoration for valor. The citation mentioned conspicuous bravery and exceptional leadership in the face of the enemy, but didn't specifically describe the Panther incident. Military citations were often vague to avoid revealing tactical details. Curry received the Victoria Cross from King George VI in a ceremony in London in October 1944. After receiving the medal, Curry returned to his regiment and continued fighting through France, Belgium, and into Germany. He survived the war and returned to Canada in 1945. He was 27 years old and had spent 6 years in the military. He returned to Saskatchewan and became a businessman, eventually serving in the Canadian Parliament. He rarely spoke about the war, and when asked about the Victoria Cross, he would say only that he was honored to receive it, but that many soldiers had done things equally brave without receiving recognition. The captured Panther tank had an interesting fate. After being repaired, it was used briefly by Canadian forces for training, allowing Canadian tank crews to familiarize themselves with German armor. Then, in late 1944, the Panther was shipped to Britain for detailed technical analysis. British engineers disassembled it completely, documenting every component, every design feature, every mechanical system. This analysis influenced post-war British tank design. After the technical analysis, the Panther was partially reassembled and placed in storage. It remained in storage until 1979, when it was transferred to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. The museum restored the Panther to display condition and exhibited it with a placard explaining that this specific tank had been captured by Major David Curry and his crew in August 1944 and driven through German lines to Allied positions. The German perspective. In 1987, a German tank historian named Dr. Franz Becker was researching Panther tank losses in Normandy. Becker had access to German military archives that documented tank production, deployment, and loss records. Becker noticed an unusual entry. A Panther tank from the 12th SS Panzer Division was listed as captured intact by Canadian forces August 18, 1944, near Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives. This was unusual because Panthers were rarely captured intact. Most Panthers lost in combat were destroyed by fire, ammunition explosions, or deliberate demolition by retreating crews. Panthers captured intact were extremely rare because German crews typically destroyed their tanks before abandoning them. Becker wanted to know how this specific Panther had been captured. Becker researched further and discovered Canadian military records describing Curry's actions on August 18, 1944. Becker was stunned. A Canadian tank crew had stolen an abandoned German Panther and driven it through German lines to Allied positions while being pursued by German armor. This seemed almost impossible. Becker wrote to the Canadian War Museum asking for information about the Panther in their collection. The museum provided documentation. The tank was the same Panther captured by Curry in 1944. Becker requested permission to examine the tank. The museum agreed. In 1988, Becker traveled to Ottawa to examine the Panther. He brought German technical manuals and compared them to the actual tank. Everything matched. This was definitively a Panther Ausf G, variant G, from the 12th SS Panzer Division. Becker examined the damage to the engine compartment and confirmed it matched the description from Canadian records, a 75mm penetration from the rear during pursuit. Becker wanted to understand the German crew's perspective. Why had they abandoned the Panther intact? German tank crews were trained to destroy their tanks before abandoning them to prevent capture. Becker researched German unit records from August 18, 1944, and found a clue. The 12th SS Panzer Division was retreating chaotically during the Falaise Pocket Battle. Multiple Panthers had been abandoned when they ran out of fuel or suffered mechanical breakdowns during the retreat. Crews were ordered to destroy abandoned tanks, but in the chaos of retreat, some crews simply fled without completing demolition procedures. Becker concluded that Curry's captured Panther had likely been abandoned by its crew during a hasty retreat, and the crew either didn't have time or didn't follow procedures to destroy it. This provided Curry with an intact, functional tank that he could steal. Becker wrote to Curry's family. Curry had died in 1986 at age 68, asking if they would be willing to discuss the Panther capture. Curry's son, David Curry Jr., responded. David Jr. was 52 years old and had grown up hearing occasional stories about his father's war service, but had never fully understood the details of the Panther incident. Becker and David Jr. corresponded for several years. Becker provided German documentation about Panther tanks and explained the German perspective on how rare intact captures were. David Jr. provided his father's personal notes and letters describing the incident. In one letter from 1965, Curry had written to a friend, "The Panther capture gets described as heroic, but it was mostly desperate improvisation. We were stranded in enemy territory with no good options. Stealing the Panther seemed slightly less suicidal than walking back."
Everything worked out, but it could easily have gone wrong in a dozen different ways. We were chased by German armor, nearly shot by our own anti-tank guns, and the engine quit 50 meters after we reached friendly lines. If any of those variables had been slightly different, we'd have been killed. Luck mattered more than skill. Becker found this assessment modest but accurate. The Panther capture required skill. Curry had to figure out German tank controls quickly, navigate through a battlefield, and make correct decisions under extreme stress. But it also required luck. Finding an intact, abandoned Panther, not being caught by Germans while boarding it, surviving the pursuit, and being recognized by Allied forces before they fired. Becker asked David Jr. what he thought his father would want people to know about the incident. David Jr. said, "My father was proud of his service, but didn't think the Panther capture defined him. He was more proud of his work after the war, building businesses, serving in Parliament, supporting his community. The Panther story was something that happened during 6 years of military service. He lived another 41 years after the war. He wanted to be remembered for the full 68 years, not just one incident in 1944. The mechanical perspective. In 1995, Canadian War Museum curators decided to do a comprehensive restoration of the captured Panther for the museum's 50th anniversary exhibit. The restoration required completely disassembling the tank, refurbishing every component, and reassembling it to museum display standards. The restoration team, led by curator Michael Whitby, discovered fascinating details. The Panther's engine showed evidence of hasty field repairs. German mechanics had replaced several components with improvised parts, suggesting the tank had been maintained under difficult conditions. The gun showed approximately 300 rounds had been fired based on barrel wear. This Panther had seen considerable combat before being abandoned. Most interesting, the restoration team found personal items left by the German crew. A photograph of a woman and child stuck to the commander's position. A letter in German dated August 15, 1944, and a pack of German cigarettes in the loader's position. The letter was translated. It was from a German Panzer crewman to his wife, describing exhaustion and fear as Allied forces surrounded German positions. The letter said, "We are fighting constantly with little rest. The Allies have endless tanks and aircraft. We destroy 5 Shermans and 10 more appear. I don't know how much longer we can hold. I hope to see you again when this ends." The letter was never sent. The crew apparently abandoned the Panther before mailing it. Whitby contacted Becker, asking if German records could identify the Panther's crew. Becker researched and found a partial crew roster for Panthers from the 12th SS Panzer Division in August 1944. The roster was incomplete, but mentioned a Panther commander named Oberfeldwebel Staff Sergeant Heinrich Weber. Becker couldn't confirm this was the specific Panther's crew, but the timing and unit matched. Becker attempted to locate Weber or his family, but found no records. Weber was listed as missing in action after August 1944, suggesting he was either killed later in the war or died in Soviet captivity. His fate was unknown. The photograph and letter found in the Panther remained unidentified. Whitby decided to include these items in the museum exhibit. The exhibit displayed the restored Panther with explanatory text describing Curry's capture of the tank in 1944. Beside the tank, a display case showed the photograph, letter, and cigarettes found during restoration. The display text explained, "This Panther was both a German weapon and a German crew's home during desperate fighting in August 1944. The crew abandoned it during chaotic retreat. Hours later, Canadian soldiers captured it and used it to escape enemy territory." The same tank served both sides, reflecting the chaos of war. The exhibit opened in 1995 and was extremely popular. Thousands of visitors came to see the captured Panther. Many visitors were struck by the human elements: the photograph, the unsent letter, the cigarettes. One visitor comment book entry said, "I came to see a captured tank. I left thinking about the German crew who abandoned it and the Canadian crew who captured it, and how both crews were just trying to survive." The lesson. The lesson from Curry's story is not primarily about tanks or military tactics. It is about desperate improvisation under impossible circumstances. Curry and his crew were stranded in enemy territory with no good options. They could retreat on foot and probably be killed. They could stay and probably be captured. They could surrender immediately, or they could attempt something absurd: steal an enemy tank and drive it through enemy lines to Allied positions. The absurd option was dangerous, but offered a chance of survival that the other options didn't. Curry chose the absurd option. This required skill, figuring out German tank controls, navigating a battlefield, making correct tactical decisions, but it also required luck. Finding an intact tank, not being caught while boarding, surviving pursuit, being recognized by Allied forces. Curry understood this balance. His 1965 letter acknowledged that luck mattered more than skill. He could have done everything perfectly and still been killed if variables had aligned differently. The German Panther pursuing him could have hit with its first shot instead of missing. Allied anti-tank guns could have fired before recognizing him. The engine could have seized 500 meters earlier while still in German territory. None of these things happened. Curry and his crew survived, brought an intact Panther to Allied lines, and provided valuable intelligence about German armor. Curry received the Victoria Cross. The story became famous. But the underlying reality was that desperate improvisation under impossible circumstances sometimes works, and sometimes doesn't. And the difference is often luck as much as skill. This doesn't diminish what Curry did. Choosing to attempt something absurd when all conventional options are bad requires courage. Successfully executing the absurd attempt requires skill. Surviving requires both skill and luck. Curry demonstrated all of these, but he remained modest about it because he understood how easily it could have ended differently. The German crew who abandoned the Panther also made choices under desperate circumstances. They were retreating chaotically, probably low on fuel or ammunition, possibly facing mechanical problems. They should have destroyed the Panther before abandoning it. They didn't. Maybe they panicked. Maybe they didn't have time. Maybe they followed orders poorly. Whatever the reason, their failure to destroy the tank created the opportunity for Curry to capture it. Both crews, German and Canadian, were trying to survive difficult circumstances. The German crew failed to destroy their tank properly. The Canadian crew exploited that failure to escape enemy territory. Neither side was inherently heroic or villainous. Both were humans making decisions under extreme stress with imperfect information and limited options. Sometimes desperate improvisation works. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you find an intact enemy tank exactly when you need one. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes luck aligns with skill. Sometimes it doesn't. Curry's story demonstrates what happens when desperate improvisation, skill, and luck all align correctly. The result was remarkable, but it could easily have been tragedy instead of triumph. The difference was often variables beyond anyone's control. Curry lived 41 years after the war. He built businesses, served in Parliament, raised a family. The Panther capture was one incident in a full life. Curry preferred to be remembered for the full life, not one incident. But the incident remains remarkable precisely because it demonstrates what humans can accomplish when faced with impossible circumstances and willing to attempt the absurd. Sometimes the absurd option is the only option with any chance of success. Sometimes attempting it actually works. Curry's story is one of those times.